The screaming started before anyone even saw the gorilla. A terrified family rushed backward across the concrete viewing hall of Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary, while security alarms flashed red above the exits. And at the center of the chaos stood a massive female gorilla named Mara, completely frozen in place, staring at one single woman as if she had just seen a ghost. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. For nearly 29 years, nobody had been able to get close to Mara. Not trainers, not veterinarians, not even the keepers who fed her every morning through reinforced steel doors. The sanctuary staff called her the Untouched One because every attempt at human contact ended the exact same way. Shattered equipment, emergency lockdowns, and a terrified room full of people forced to back away from the glass enclosure before things spiraled out of control. Mara had spent almost 3 decades living inside the largest isolated habitat on the property, a quiet forest enclosure surrounded by 20-foot barriers and thick observation glass strong enough to stop a charging rhinoceros. Most visitors never even saw her. She hated crowds, hated noise, hated eye contact. Sometimes she disappeared into the trees for days without showing herself once. But that Tuesday morning felt wrong from the very beginning. The air inside the sanctuary carried an uneasy stillness. Even the birds around the property had gone strangely quiet. Daniel Brooks, the sanctuary director, noticed it during his early rounds just after 8 a.m. Mara had refused breakfast for the 3rd straight day. The untouched pile of fruit still sat near the feeding gate, while the giant gorilla remained hidden somewhere deep inside her habitat. Something's bothering her, Daniel quietly told Dr. Naomi Reed, the senior veterinarian, as they watched. Security footage from the previous night. Mara had barely slept. Hour after hour, she paced in slow circles beneath the trees, stopping every few minutes to stare toward the public entrance tunnel like she was waiting for something to appear. Then, shortly after noon, Claire Donovan walked into the sanctuary. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a scientist. Just a quiet 34-year-old woman from Oregon visiting Northern California during a work trip. She bought a standard admission ticket, grabbed a paper map, and wandered through the exhibits alone while answering emails on her phone. Nothing about her stood out. But the second Claire stepped inside the gorilla observation hall, Mara exploded out of the trees. Visitors gasped as branches snapped violently behind the enclosure. The massive silver-black gorilla came charging across the habitat floor so fast that parents yanked their children away from the glass. A loud impact shook the room as Mara slammed both hands against the viewing wall with enough force to rattle the benches beneath people's feet. Security alarms activated instantly. But instead of showing aggression toward the crowd, Mara ignored everyone else completely. Her dark eyes locked onto Claire. The woman froze in confusion while the enormous gorilla slowly rose upright behind the glass, breathing heavily, her chest trembling with deep, uneven sounds no one in the sanctuary had ever heard before. "Get her away from the enclosure right now," Daniel shouted into his radio as staff rushed toward the exits. But Claire couldn't move, because as the terrified crowd backed away, Mara suddenly lifted one giant hand and pressed it gently against the glass directly in front of Claire's face. Then the gorilla looked down at Claire's wrist and let out a low, broken sound that made Dr. Naomi turn pale almost instantly. Nobody inside Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary could explain what happened over the next 48 hours. After Claire Donovan left the observation hall that afternoon, Mara completely abandoned every behavior pattern the staff had documented for nearly 3 decades. At first, the changes seemed small, subtle, easy to dismiss as stress from the earlier incident. But by the following morning, the entire sanctuary staff had begun whispering about it. Mara was moving constantly. Usually, the giant gorilla followed the exact same routine every day. She slept near the north rock wall, ate around sunrise, and disappeared into the trees during visitor hours. But now security cameras showed her circling the enclosure through the entire night without resting once. She was not pacing randomly either. Every 20 minutes, almost with perfect precision, Mara stopped at the same section of glass where Claire had stood the day before. Then she would sit there motionless for several minutes before walking away again. "She is waiting," one of the overnight guards muttered nervously while reviewing footage with Daniel and Naomi shortly after dawn. Daniel did not answer, because deep down, he was beginning to think the guard was right. By noon, Mara had started doing something even stranger. She began collecting objects from around her enclosure and arranging them near the viewing glass in careful little rows. Leaves, pieces of rope from enrichment toys, small stones, wooden feeding blocks. She carried each item gently in her massive hands before setting them down in front of the exact same spot Claire had occupied. Nobody had ever seen Mara organize objects before. In fact, she usually destroyed enrichment items within minutes of receiving them. But now she moved with slow concentration, almost ritualistic precision. Visitors gathered around the glass, whispering in confusion, while Mara ignored all of them completely. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the public entrance tunnel, then returned to rearranging the objects again, as though something about the order mattered deeply to her. Naomi watched the behavior from the staff corridor with growing unease. "This is cognitive recall behavior," she said quietly. "I have only seen something like this once before." Daniel folded his arms tightly. "In gorillas?" Naomi hesitated. "No," she admitted softly. "In humans with trauma." That afternoon, Claire received 3 separate phone calls from the sanctuary asking if she would be willing to return. At first she refused. Politely. The entire situation unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She could not stop thinking about Mara's eyes or the strange feeling that passed through the room when the gorilla copied her hand movement. But late that evening, curiosity finally overcame her discomfort. Around 5:30 p.m., Claire stepped back into the sanctuary just before closing hours. The moment she entered the observation hall, Mara reacted instantly. But this time there was no pounding glass, no alarm, no aggression. Instead, the giant gorilla disappeared. Staff and visitors looked around in confusion as Mara suddenly sprinted into the far end of her habitat and vanished behind the trees. "What is she doing?" Claire whispered. Nobody answered. Nearly 2 full minutes passed in complete silence. Then branches began shaking deep inside the enclosure. Mara slowly emerged from the shadows, carrying something large wrapped carefully in old gray fabric against her chest. The entire room fell quiet. The gorilla approached the glass with slow, deliberate steps, keeping her eyes locked on Claire the entire time. Then, for the first time in 29 years, Mara lowered herself completely onto the concrete floor directly in front of a human being. Her massive hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the faded blanket beside the glass. Inside it was a tiny collection of objects nobody at the sanctuary had ever seen before. An old yellowed photograph, a rusted metal keychain, and a thin silver bracelet nearly identical to the one on Claire's wrist. Naomi suddenly stopped breathing, because stitched into the corner of the blanket in faded blue thread were 2 barely visible letters. CD. The room inside Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary erupted into nervous whispers the moment staff saw the objects Mara had hidden for decades. Nobody understood how the gorilla could possibly possess a photograph, an old keychain, and a bracelet nearly identical to Claire's. But instead of bringing clarity, the discovery immediately created fear. Not fear of violence, fear of responsibility. Daniel Brooks stared at the faded initials stitched into the blanket while several senior staff members gathered behind him, exchanging uneasy looks. "This cannot leave the sanctuary," one of them muttered under his breath. Claire looked confused. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered her directly. Naomi carefully stepped closer to the glass, her eyes fixed on the old photograph lying beside Mara's massive hand. The picture was badly worn from age, but one detail remained painfully visible. A young woman smiling beside a much smaller gorilla wrapped in the same gray blanket. Claire felt her stomach tighten. The woman in the picture looked hauntingly familiar. Before she could speak, Daniel suddenly motioned for security to clear the observation hall immediately. "Everybody out," he ordered firmly. Now, visitors were escorted away while heavy steel doors sealed the public corridor from the rest of the sanctuary. Mara instantly reacted to the movement. The giant gorilla grabbed the blanket protectively and backed toward the glass, letting out deep, uneasy vocal sounds while keeping her eyes locked on Claire. "She is becoming possessive," one of the security officers warned. "This is escalating attachment behavior." Claire frowned. Possessive? She has not hurt anyone. Not yet, the officer replied quietly. That sentence changed the entire atmosphere inside the room. Suddenly, Mara was no longer being discussed like a lonely animal showing emotion. Staff began speaking about her like a risk. An unstable animal. A liability. Daniel hated the direction the conversation was going. But Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary was already under heavy pressure from donors and state inspectors after several recent controversies involving animal welfare regulations. One viral video of an emotionally distressed gorilla interacting unpredictably with a visitor could destroy the sanctuary's reputation overnight. We cannot allow this situation to continue, one board representative said over speakerphone later that evening during an emergency meeting. Claire sat silently at the end of the conference table while staff reviewed footage of Mara's strange behavior from the last 2 days. The more they watched, the more unsettled everyone became. In every clip, Mara ignored food, enrichment toys, and staff instructions entirely. She only waited at the glass for Claire. This is dependency formation, another consultant insisted remotely. If the gorilla fixates on a single person after decades of isolation, the psychological crash could be catastrophic if that connection disappears. Claire finally spoke. Then maybe she should not disappear. The room fell quiet. Daniel rubbed his tired eyes. You do not understand what happens when traumatized primates form emotional attachments this quickly, he said carefully. If something interrupts that bond, the animal can deteriorate fast. Claire looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. What if this bond already existed long before today? Nobody responded. Because deep down, everyone in that room was beginning to suspect she might be right. But admitting that possibility created an even bigger problem. If Mara had truly remembered someone connected to her past after 29 years, then the sanctuary's entire history with the gorilla might not be what they claimed it was. Naomi quietly reopened old archived medical files that night searching for answers, but several key documents were missing. Entire years of Mara's early rehabilitation records had disappeared from the database. The deeper Naomi searched, the more nervous Daniel became. Around midnight, security cameras captured something deeply disturbing inside Mara's enclosure. The giant gorilla had dragged the old blanket to the sleeping area and wrapped it carefully around herself before sitting directly beside the glass wall facing the empty hallway where Claire had stood earlier. She remained there for over 4 straight hours without moving. Not sleeping, not eating, just waiting. The next morning, the sanctuary board made a decision. For Mara's psychological stability, Claire Donovan would no longer be allowed anywhere near the enclosure. And if the gorilla's fixation continued, Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary would begin preparing to transfer Mara permanently to an isolated behavioral containment facility in Colorado. Claire Donovan could not stop thinking about the blanket. Long after she returned to her hotel that night, the image of Mara carefully unfolding those hidden objects replayed over and over inside her mind. It was not the photograph or the bracelet that disturbed her most. It was the way the gorilla handled them. Gently, deliberately, like someone protecting the last pieces of a life nobody else remembered anymore. Around 2 a.m., Claire finally gave up trying to sleep and opened the small leather suitcase she had brought on her work trip. Buried beneath folded sweaters and charging cables sat an old cedar box she had inherited after her mother passed away 6 years earlier. Claire had not opened it in months. Most of the contents were ordinary family keepsakes, birthday cards, postcards from different states, faded receipts, small photographs. But as she searched through the box, something suddenly caught her attention. A folded piece of paper tucked inside the back corner. The edges were brittle with age. Across the top, written in blue ink almost 30 years earlier, were the words, Redwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Program. Claire frowned. She had never heard her mother mention that place before. Slowly unfolding the paper, Claire discovered it was not a letter at all. It was a visitor authorization badge. The name printed across the front read, Evelyn Donovan. Beneath it, in smaller faded lettering, was a handwritten clearance note that made Claire's stomach tighten instantly. Authorized for Infant Behavioral Contact Unit B. Unit B. Claire whispered the words under her breath while staring at the old card in confusion. The next morning, she returned to Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary before sunrise. She knew she was no longer allowed near Mara's enclosure. but she could not shake the feeling that something important had been hidden from everyone for years. Daniel was already waiting outside the administrative building when Claire arrived. He looked exhausted. "You should not be here," he said quietly. Claire pulled the old badge from her coat pocket without saying a word. Daniel's expression changed immediately. He stared at the card for several seconds before slowly taking it from her hands. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It belonged to my mother." Daniel looked genuinely shaken for the first time since all of this began. Before he could respond, Naomi hurried into the hallway carrying several dusty archive folders against her chest. "Daniel," she said breathlessly, "I found something." Inside the oldest medical records, Naomi uncovered a series of handwritten behavioral evaluations from Mara's early years at the sanctuary. Most were incomplete or damaged, but one detail appeared repeatedly throughout the files. The same phrase written over and over by different staff members. "Subject becomes calm during musical stimulus." Naomi spread several pages across the conference table while Claire and Daniel read silently. According to the reports, infant Mara had severe panic responses around unfamiliar staff, loud noises, and physical restraint. But oddly, one thing consistently soothed her: singing. Specifically, a woman humming the same melody during feeding and recovery sessions. The subject displays immediate emotional stabilization when exposed to the female caregiver's vocal pattern, one note explained. Claire felt chills move down her arms. Because without even thinking, she suddenly recognized the melody described in the report. Her mother used to hum it while cooking dinner when Claire was little. The realization hit her so suddenly she stopped breathing for a moment. Naomi slowly looked up from the paperwork. "Claire," she whispered carefully, "did your mother ever work with animals?" Claire shook her head uncertainly. "Not that I knew of." But before anyone could continue the conversation, a loud emergency call crackled through Daniel's radio. "Director Brooks, we need you at the enclosure immediately." Daniel grabbed the radio. "What happened?" The voice on the other end sounded nervous. "It is Mara. She stopped eating completely this morning." A long silence followed before the keeper added one final sentence in a trembling voice. "And she keeps making the same sound over and over while holding that old blanket against the glass." Naomi quickly gathered the records back into her arms. Then she looked directly at Daniel with growing determination. "We are missing something huge here," she said quietly, "and I think it is time we find out what really happened in Unit B." Daniel Brooks had worked at Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary for almost 20 years, but nothing prepared him for what he found inside the abandoned records room beneath the oldest wing of the facility. Dust covered everything. Filing cabinets lined the walls beside broken monitors and outdated medical equipment that had not been touched in decades. Naomi carefully carried the archive box marked Unit B onto a metal table while Claire stood nearby, trying to steady her breathing. Most of the files inside were damaged by moisture and age, but buried beneath old rehabilitation logs sat a small stack of unlabeled videotapes. Daniel frowned as he picked one up. Written across the tape in faded black marker were only 4 words. "Behavioral Contact, Trial 7. Naomi located an old VHS player still connected to a dusty television in the corner of the room. The screen flickered weakly to life as the tape began rolling through heavy static. At first, the footage showed exactly what they expected. A tiny infant gorilla wrapped in gray fabric sitting alone inside a recovery enclosure. Mara. She looked impossibly small compared to the massive animal she had become. Thin arms, nervous eyes, tiny trembling hands clutching the same blanket now hidden inside her habitat. Claire felt her chest tighten as the footage continued. Several staff members entered the enclosure one after another attempting to feed or comfort the young gorilla. Every attempt failed. Infant Mara recoiled in panic each time someone approached her. But then another person entered the frame. A young woman wearing a sanctuary volunteer badge. Claire immediately stopped breathing. It was her mother, younger, smiling softly as she sat down on the floor several feet away from the frightened gorilla. Unlike the others, Evelyn Donovan did not move closer. She simply began humming quietly, the exact melody from the medical reports. Slowly, impossibly, infant Mara began inching toward her across the floor. Naomi covered her mouth in shock as the tiny gorilla finally curled against Evelyn's side, while the young woman wrapped the gray blanket gently around both of them. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. But the real shock had not happened yet. The footage suddenly jumped ahead several days. This time the camera showed chaos inside the enclosure. Staff shouting, radios crackling, men in dark uniforms entering Unit B carrying transport equipment. Daniel leaned closer to the screen in confusion. What is this? Naomi stared silently as one terrified staff member argued with another near the camera. You cannot move her yet, a woman's voice shouted in panic. She is bonded to Evelyn now. Then another voice answered coldly. The board already approved the transfer. The pharmaceutical sponsors want the subject relocated tonight. Claire felt ice move through her body. Pharmaceutical sponsors? The tape crackled again before revealing infant Mara screaming in visible distress while handlers attempted to remove her from the enclosure. But the tiny gorilla was not attacking anyone. She kept reaching desperately toward the hallway outside the room. Toward Evelyn. Then the screen froze for several seconds before the final portion of footage appeared. Claire's mother stood directly in front of the transport gate, arguing furiously with sanctuary executives while clutching a silver bracelet in her hand. You promised this was rehabilitation, Evelyn shouted. Not experimentation. Daniel's face drained of color instantly. Naomi slowly turned toward him. They lied about Unit B, she whispered. This was never a rehabilitation program. The footage continued rolling. One final moment. Evelyn suddenly kneeling beside infant Mara one last time while slipping the silver bracelet beneath the folds of the gray blanket. Then she whispered something directly into the baby gorilla's ear before staff forced her away from the enclosure forever. The tape ended abruptly in static. Nobody in the room moved. Claire sat frozen in front of the flickering screen with tears filling her eyes as the truth crashed over all of them at once. Mara had never spent 29 years trapped in emotional isolation because she hated humans. She had spent 29 years waiting for the only person who ever tried to save her to come back. And when Claire walked into the sanctuary, wearing her mother's bracelet, Mara had not been becoming dangerous. She had been trying with everything she had left to return the proof of what Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary had done. For several long minutes after the videotape ended, nobody inside the archive room spoke a single word. The faint buzzing of the old television was the only sound left in the silence. Claire sat motionless with tears running quietly down her face, while her mother's final image remained frozen on the dusty screen beside infant Mara wrapped tightly in the gray blanket. Daniel Brooks slowly lowered himself into a chair like the weight of the last 29 years had suddenly collapsed onto his shoulders all at once. He had dedicated nearly half his life to Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary, believing he was protecting broken animals from cruelty. But now every memory involving Mara felt different. Every report, every emergency lockdown, every lonely night the giant gorilla spent waiting beside the glass. Naomi stared at the stack of old behavioral evaluations spread across the table, her hands trembling slightly as pieces finally began connecting inside her mind. Mara had never been unstable. She had never been emotionally dangerous. The strange object arrangements near the viewing glass were not random compulsions. The blanket was not meaningless comfort behavior. The repeated pacing, the waiting, the refusal to leave the observation wall after Claire appeared. Mara had been trying desperately to communicate with people who spent decades refusing to understand her. She remembered everything, Naomi whispered softly. Daniel closed his eyes. He suddenly remembered a winter storm nearly 8 years earlier when sanctuary staff found Mara pressing old newspaper clippings against the enclosure glass during a power outage. At the time, everyone assumed she was reacting to reflections from emergency lights. Now he realized something horrifying. One of those newspaper clippings had included a faded photograph of a young volunteer standing near the original Unit B facility. Evelyn Donovan. Mara had recognized her face even then. Claire slowly reached toward the old videotape still resting inside. The player. My mother tried to stop them, she whispered through tears. Naomi nodded silently. And Mara spent 29 years protecting the only evidence that proved it. The realization hit Daniel harder than anything else. Mara had hidden those objects all this time not because she was emotionally trapped in the past, but because somewhere deep inside, she understood those items mattered. The photograph, the bracelet, the blanket. She had preserved them like memories nobody else was willing to keep alive. Suddenly Daniel stood up, so quickly his chair scraped hard across the floor. "The transfer order," he said sharply. Naomi looked up instantly. "Daniel, if they move her now," he interrupted, "everything tied to Unit B disappears with her." Claire wiped her eyes. "Then we cannot let them take her." Daniel hesitated only a second before making a decision that could cost him his career. He grabbed the emergency transfer authorization forms from the conference table and tore them clean in half. "Nobody moves Mara anywhere," he said firmly. Hours later, the three of them quietly returned to the enclosure after visitor hours ended. The sanctuary felt completely different now. The same concrete hallways and steel gates that once seemed safe suddenly carried the heavy feeling of buried secrets. As they approached the observation glass, Mara was already there waiting in the darkness. The giant gorilla sat wrapped partly in the faded blanket with the hidden objects carefully arranged beside her exactly as before. But this time, nobody looked at her with fear. Claire stepped closer to the glass, slowly, while Naomi and Daniel remained behind her in silence. Mara immediately lifted her head. The exhaustion in her eyes was still there, but now something else appeared too. Relief. As though after decades of isolation, someone had finally understood what she had been trying to say all along. Claire carefully placed her hand against the glass again. Mara stared at her for several seconds before reaching beneath the folds of the blanket. Very gently, the massive gorilla lifted the old photograph and pressed it softly against the barrier between them. Claire's breath caught in her throat, because on the back corner of the photograph, barely visible beneath years of wear, her mother had written a single sentence in blue ink. "If anything happens to me, please do not leave her alone again." Daniel looked down instantly, unable to hide the tears filling his eyes anymore. And for the first time in 29 years, someone inside Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary finally promised Mara that they would not. Over the next several days, Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary quietly began changing in ways that had not happened in nearly 3 decades. Not because of public pressure, not because of lawsuits or media attention, but because for the first time, the people responsible for Mara stopped trying to manage her behavior and finally started listening to it. Daniel Brooks personally suspended the transfer order and sealed every remaining Unit B archive from outside review until Naomi could finish documenting the evidence connected to Mara's history. Several board members protested immediately, but Daniel no longer cared about protecting the sanctuary's reputation more than the animal who had spent 29 years carrying its buried truth alone. Meanwhile, something extraordinary started happening inside Mara's enclosure. The giant gorilla slowly began letting go of her constant state of fear. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Small things changed first. On the second morning after the videotape discovery, staff arrived expecting to find Mara sitting beside the observation glass again. Instead, she was outside near the stream running through the center of her habitat. It was the first time in years she had willingly spent time in the open during daylight hours. One of the younger keepers nearly cried seeing her sitting quietly beneath the morning sun with the gray blanket folded beside her instead of wrapped tightly against her chest. Naomi noticed other changes too. Mara started sleeping normally again. The restless pacing stopped. For the first time in months, she finished every meal placed inside the enclosure. But the most emotional moment happened 3 days later when Claire returned carrying something carefully protected inside a small paper bag. Sanctuary policy still prohibited direct contact, so Claire sat quietly on the opposite side of the glass while Mara watched her closely from several feet away. Slowly, Claire removed an old portable cassette player from the bag. "My mother used to keep this everywhere," she whispered softly. Daniel and Naomi stood silently behind her while Claire inserted a worn cassette tape into the machine. A faint click echoed through the observation hall. Then, through the old static-filled speaker, a soft recording began playing. It was Evelyn Donovan's voice humming the same melody from the Unit B footage almost 30 years earlier. The reaction inside the enclosure was immediate. Mara froze completely. The giant gorilla slowly lifted her head as though time itself had suddenly stopped around her. For several long seconds, she did not move at all. Then something happened that nobody inside Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary would ever forget. Mara carefully picked up the gray blanket from the ground and carried it toward the glass with both hands. But instead of clutching it protectively against herself like she always had before, she gently laid it down in front of Claire. It was the first time Mara had willingly set the blanket out of her reach in nearly 3 decades. Claire pressed her trembling hand against the glass while tears rolled silently down her face. "You kept it safe all this time," she whispered. Mara lowered herself slowly onto the concrete floor across from Claire and closed her eyes while Evelyn's humming continued softly through the old cassette player. The giant gorilla's breathing became calm and steady, the deep tension that had lived inside her body for years finally beginning to disappear. Even Daniel had to look away for a moment to compose himself, because everyone in that room understood what they were witnessing. Mara was not simply remembering someone she loved. She was finally realizing she had not been abandoned after all. Later that evening, Naomi updated Mara's behavioral records for the first time since becoming head veterinarian. Under the section labeled psychological condition, she deleted the phrase severe social instability and replaced it with something entirely different. Subject demonstrates prolonged emotional memory, protective attachment behavior, and extraordinary trust retention despite prolonged trauma. But inside the quiet enclosure beyond the glass, none of those clinical words truly mattered anymore. Because while the old cassette continued humming softly through the speaker, Mara slowly drifted to sleep beside the blanket for the first peaceful night anyone at the sanctuary could remember. Spring arrived quietly at Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary that year, but for the people who worked there, everything felt different after Mara's story finally came to light. The old Unit B program was permanently shut down and publicly investigated, while several forgotten archive records were restored and released under Daniel Brooks's supervision. Yet the biggest change inside the sanctuary was not written in reports or legal documents. It was visible every morning just after sunrise near the observation glass where Mara used to sit alone for hours in silence. She no longer waited there anymore. Instead, visitors now often found the giant gorilla resting peacefully near the stream or walking calmly through the trees while morning light moved softly across her silver-black fur. The constant tension that once surrounded her seemed to fade more each week. Even the sanctuary staff noticed it in small, everyday moments that would have sounded impossible only months earlier. Mara began accepting enrichment items from keepers without retreating into hiding. She allowed Naomi to conduct health checks without signs of distress. Sometimes, during quiet afternoons when the sanctuary was nearly empty, she even sat near the observation hall listening calmly, while Claire played old cassette recordings of Evelyn's humming through the portable speaker. But perhaps the most emotional change happened inside Claire herself. Before coming to Redwood Wildlife Sanctuary, she had spent years struggling with the loss of her mother and the unanswered silence that followed her death. Evelyn Donovan had always seemed like a mystery to her, a person filled with hidden pieces Claire never fully understood while growing up. Yet somehow, through Mara, those missing pieces slowly returned. Not through words, through memories, through gestures, through an old blanket protected for nearly 30 years by an animal the world misunderstood completely. One afternoon several months later, Daniel invited Claire into a newly renovated section of the sanctuary that had once been closed to the public. The old concrete walls from Unit B had been removed and replaced with open glass overlooking the forest habitat. Near the entrance stood a small bronze plaque surrounded by wildflowers planted by sanctuary staff. Claire stared at it silently, while warm wind moved through the trees nearby. The plaque carried only a few simple words. In honor of Evelyn Donovan, who believed healing begins when fear ends. Claire covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again. But before she could speak, movement appeared beyond the glass outside. Mara had approached quietly without anyone noticing. The giant gorilla stood beneath the trees watching Claire from a short distance away while sunlight filtered softly through the leaves around her. Then, slowly, Mara did something she had never done before. She lowered the old gray blanket onto the grass beside the stream and walked away from it, not hiding it, not carrying it back into isolation, leaving it behind peacefully beneath the open sky. Naomi smiled softly through tears while Daniel stood silent beside her, because everyone understood what that moment meant. For 29 years, the blanket had been Mara's last connection to the person who tried to save her. Her proof, her memory, her protection against being forgotten again. And now, for the first time, she no longer needed to guard it alone. Claire stepped closer to the glass, while Mara paused at the edge of the forest one final time before disappearing between the trees. The giant gorilla turned her head slightly toward Claire, calm and unafraid, before continuing deeper into the sanctuary she had once feared for most of her life. And as the wind moved softly across the abandoned blanket beside the stream, Claire finally understood something her mother had known long ago. Sometimes the ones we call broken are only waiting for someone to finally believe them.